Okay, so the announcements for today, that the test marks are released. Assignment 2 is due on Thursday. And today we're talking about non-functional requirements and human aspects, which ties into our learning outcome number 5, which is around eliciting functional, non-functional requirements, including human aspects. Cool. Okay, now that you can hear me, I'll get into the non-functional requirements and this cartoon which I was explaining. Okay, so top left is number 1 is this idea, of how different stakeholders in the software ecosystem visualize or understand the software requirements. Okay, or rather misunderstand the requirements. So top left, number 1 is how the customer explained it. All right, so they're explaining a swing, which is, as you can see, it's not very functional. It's got like 3 levels. Maybe somebody right at the top can, use it, but not very functional. Number 2 is how the project leader understood it, which is also kind of equally non-functional, or maybe even worse, like it can't even swing, but it's a different kind of non-functional. Number 3 is how the analyst designed it. So as you can see, it looks like it's super over-engineered solution. They have taken what the project leader said and tried to make it functional, as you can see, right? The programmer who wrote it, number 4, is basically it's not even a swing, it's like a piece of wood at the bottom. What the beta testers received, which is pretty savage there in terms of, it's not going to go well. How the business consultants described it, which is number 6. So they really, pitched up the product. They're like, oh, this is going to be a comfy seat. You're going to swing in it, there's sun rising from the back or whatever. Then you come up to number 7 is how the project was documented, which is not missing in action, pretty much not documented. You definitely don't want to do that as software teams. You do want to document your project. What operations installed, which is also hilarious. And then how the customer was billed. So obviously this is a funny take, but some of this hits true in certain ways. So the customer was billed for a rather sophisticated roller coaster where it wasn't exactly what was delivered. So how was it supported, which is not a lot of support. And what marketing advertised, which is a little bit of a take on Apple in terms of the black and white and the eye swing idea. And number 12 is what the customer really needed. So they needed a simple way of having a little bit of fun on a sunny day like today, out in the backyard. Simple something like a rope and a tie would have been enough. But this is often put out as an explanation of how the different stakeholders, as I said, in the software ecosystem view the exact same requirements or understand or misunderstand them in different ways. Okay, so when we talk about these requirements, there are lots of different definitions, but in simple words, if I put it in simple words, it's really what the developers need to know in order to develop the desired software features. All right, so what it is that you need to know as a software team to develop the software that your customer wants or your end user will be using. So in the project and in the unit so far, we've mainly covered functional requirements. So you've been talking to your product owners and your clients, and you've been asking them about all the features that they want in the software, right? So most of those conversations, I'm guessing, are probably centered around functional requirements, right? Which is to say, we want to create a Scrum board, or I should be able to create a user story, manage a user story, and so on. So you've been engaging in eliciting requirements from customers, how to document them, like user stories, which go in turn into product and sprint backlogs and so on, and how to store, estimate, and prioritize them. So that's mainly in the area of functional requirements. But today we're going to focus on non-functional requirements. And as we go through this, you might be able to look back at some of your own customer and product owner interactions, and you may realize, well, actually, we have covered a little bit of some of the non-functional requirements. Maybe we didn't call it that, but we did talk about it. So do feel free to reflect, but also share in the chat if there's anything that kind of rings true and you're like, oh, actually, we discussed this. Okay, so this here is a ultra simple kind of functional versus non-functional requirements sort of face off, if you like. So functional requirements essentially are the ones that specify the behavior of the system given a particular circumstance and inputs. So given the kind of software, hardware, the kinds of parameters that you provide, what should the system do? What should be the behavior of the system? Non-functional requirements, on the other hand, which are also referred to as quality attributes or quality goals or non-behavioral requirements and so on, they usually provide the properties of the system as a whole, rather than looking at, oh, what would the system do in this specific context if this happens? I mean, it does translate to that level as well, but most of the time when we talk about NFRs, they will apply to on a system-wide level. So for instance, security or privacy or accessibility. It's not as if you would build a website and make only certain parts of it accessible and not the others. So it's not a very specific scenario-based design. It can end up becoming scenario-based. So when, say, for example, a vision-impaired person is looking at your website, then what have you done to enable accessibility for them? But as I said, it would be across the website. It won't just be for a particular function. Okay, so functional requirements are easy to describe in some sense, because you can say things like, if A, B, and C happens or are provided as inputs, the software should compute or do D, right? So that's an easier way to describe what you want out of it. Non-functional requirements, on the other hand, are actually quite difficult to explain and to describe. And we will see in a minute what that looks like. Functional requirements are also usually fairly easy to translate into user stories and use cases because of that structure of given A, B, and C, the software should be doing D, and so on. You can actually start to write these user stories and use cases quite easily. Similarly, they can be tested in a straightforward manner. It may not be the easiest thing to test, or it may still be cumbersome, but the steps required or the process required to test it might be straightforward. And when it comes to non-functional requirements, they're not only challenging to actually explain and describe it, it's also very difficult to get it right and then test it also. So examples, as I said, from our project that we're working on is to create and manage a product backlog, the Scrum board, the task, the team member management. All of these are functional requirements. And I'm sure you've been talking to your product owners about this in multiple instances. Non-functional requirements, on the other hand, are things like usability, as I said, privacy, accessibility, and so on. So again, some of this you may have already talked to your clients about, but if not, then this is now a good opportunity looking up to the next sprint to be looking into some of this. All right, this is another view of comparing the functional and non-functional requirements that I got from this website that I thought actually did a good job of really pulling up some examples. So at the top, you'll see that a functional requirement might be the customer says, oh, my website will obviously have a homepage. I need a homepage. The non-functional requirement there is when you ask them for what kind of performance are you expecting, they might say, well, it should be really fast. And then you kind of dig a little bit deeper and you get them to commit and you're like, how fast is fast enough, right? So then eventually you might land at something like, okay, the homepage should load within 1.5 seconds. That's what I define as fast. So this is then an example of a non-functional requirement that is described in a very concrete detail in a way that you can actually implement it. So this was performance. Then similarly, you might have security. So a functional requirement might be that the website will store customer data. The security non-functional requirement may be that the customer data must be encrypted to level 4 encryption standards and so on. Another one, so at the bottom, for instance, you can see is a functional requirement could be that the customers can access the websites on their phone. So that's a requirement that the customer has. What's kind of behind that a little bit or related to it is the idea of compatibility. So the customer might say, well, actually, the website must be compatible with iOS 12.8 or whatever the and above, or whatever the latest and above is, right? So then that also refers to not just accessibility, because that's not what we mean by accessibility, more like compatibility to different platforms. So these are some examples of how non-functional requirements can be written to be very specific and concrete, where you can actually work on implementing them. So in other words, when you're having a conversation with your product owners and you're asking them to prioritize a key functional requirement, which you'll see in the assignment 3 brief when it comes up, you want to ask them to be as specific as possible so you can start to implement it. Okay, so let us consider a particular non-functional requirement so we can kind of dig into this a little bit more, and that's usability. So when we look at, kind of things that we use around the place and in our everyday lives, some things are really easy to use. So if you have to really consider what is the usability for a pencil, right? What are the usability standards? What would you like a pencil to have? It's not super complicated, right? So you might say, well, it needs to be able to write for one thing. So it shouldn't be broken. I should be able to sharpen it when it gets dull. And you might have other preferences around the shape and size and the color. But in terms of core functionality of being able to use it, it will be a pretty straightforward list, right? You might have other additional requirements based on how you use the system, or specific kinds of users who need a particular kind of pencil, and all of that can be captured. But when it comes to software, actually it's a lot more complex, obviously, right? So we want to allow our users to achieve whatever their desirable interactions are with the system with as much ease as possible, right? But that is easier said than done. So this here is an example of a website I actually came to know about today, which is the Big Ugly website. And it actually exists. So if you open it up, you will see, without me telling you, everything that is wrong with this website. I mean, it's a classic, and it's been built specifically for that purpose, to show designers how you can, make something so completely wrong. And in doing so, hopefully also get a sense of what are the right things to do, right? So this year, then we can see the usability for this website is pretty low, right? Okay, so continuing on with that theme of usability, let's look at some of our more common websites that we use. Some of the early search engines, for example, early 80s, 90s, Archie query form was one of them, where you could put in a query and it looks through, a database of stuff and it gives you some response. Alta Vista was another one, and that's the one in the center. And you can see that there's a bit of an ad going there. There's all sorts of parameters, like do you want to search the web or other options? You want to display the results in standard form. There's an advanced search, there's an ad URL, there's quite a lot going on, right? So while all of that might look like, oh, it's actually providing a lot of functionality, the usability of the system starts to suffer, right? Because again, there's a lot going on. On the top right, then you have Yahoo search. And again, the search bar itself is not too bad. It's pretty straightforward, but then again, a lot of busyness around a number of different links. Also trying to fit in news in there, images, video, audio, all of that. So it's even something as simple as a simple search engine is not that easy to design for usability. Now, the one that most of us actually end up using a lot every day is Google, of course. So on the left, you see an image of what the Google search engine looked like in the 90s. And it's not very different to what you saw of the Alta Vista or the Yahoo search engine in terms of there's, again, quite a few options there, and you can limit your number of results that you see on a page. There's quite an interesting comment there around index contains approximately 25 million pages, and in brackets soon to be much bigger. So how true was that? and how Google, the search engine, actually expanded. So there's the search, there's the I'm feeling lucky option, which still continues. But then because this was so new, they had a link about Google in case you didn't know who they were. And you could get Google updates monthly, and you can subscribe and blah, blah, blah. Now, the one that you see on the right is one of the more recent designs of Google, the search engine, and you can clearly see the simplicity is, the first thing that strikes you. No nonsense, get to the point. What do you want to search? And it's the Google search, or I'm feeling lucky, which lands you on one of the options straight away instead of seeing a list of options. But also note that there is no particular like enter bar or limit to search or so on, but there's a mic facility, so you could actually be voice typing into this. So obviously they've been studying usability, and they've been studying good in web design to try and make it as simple as possible. All right, so while Google was doing this, there were other kind of experiments out there that were going on around software usability. And when we look at the entire operating system and what we're used to, so I know people have different preferences, but say, for instance, if you've used the Microsoft operating system at some point, Windows, the term Windows, was based out of the metaphor that was used because every time it opened a window, right? And you could do something within that window. And there was a period of time for Microsoft where they thought that was particularly challenging for some users, and because there was nothing in the real world where you would do something would open a different window. So they're like, oh, we need to make this more relatable to how things are in the real world. And they decided to change the metaphor. So this image that you see on the right that's the actual like landing desktop of the Windows operating system, the Windows Explorer. The primary operating system, which is now equivalent to the Windows Explorer. But that's it. There's no files, folders, nothing. This is what you were meant to be. So the designers thought this was going to be super intuitive because it looks like a lounge in your house, and it's very relatable. And there's a little friendly dog that's going to help you look around and find stuff. I'm sure no one will be surprised that did not stick around. People did not enjoy this. There were a lot of things that could have been wrong. It was obviously very busy. There's also the fact that the affordances, meaning what is clickable that does something versus what is just a piece of art or decoration, isn't very clear, right? So just from looking at this, you could make some guesses, like maybe if I clicked on Jan 2, it would open a calendar, maybe. But I'm not sure if clicking on the fireplace does something, or, clicking outside the window does something. So the affordances, as we call them, were unclear. Also, because this was really, graphics heavy, it required a very high spec hardware or computer, which wasn't the norm at that time. Nowadays, we carry, smartphones that are a lot more powerful than desktops in those days. But for that era, it was actually quite a big ask to have a very high spec hardware and to be able to support this kind of a graphical operating system desktop. And as I said, they replaced the Windows metaphor with what they thought was a lot more intuitive, but obviously it didn't stick. Then let me know in the chat if you, with a yes or a no, if you've ever come across this guy called Clippy, the Microsoft Office assistant from 1996. If you've probably not used it, but you may have heard of it. It is possibly the most aggravating software feature ever. Yes. So you've heard, yeah. So there are some horror stories about how people who were using Microsoft Word at that time had this annoying assistant that would not stop popping in your face to help you. And you couldn't write 2 sentences without this guy coming up, oh, looks like you're writing a letter. Would you like to get help with? Oh my God, no, thank you. Just go away. So So yeah, exactly. It looks like you're doing you're trying to write a lecture or something. Can I help you with that? Or whatever it is that you're trying to do, can I help you with that? So annoying. Because no, we don't need help with that. And our irony is it's actually based out of quite a sophisticated Bayesian AI algorithm, which detects when possibly the user is likely to get into trouble, like, get stuck with something. And then they use that opportunity to offer appropriate advice that they thought was appropriate anyway. So there was a lot wrong with this, especially in terms of the number of times it popped up and all of the inappropriate places it popped up in. Now, if you think about why somebody would have designed this or a team would have designed this, the intentions were good, right? They were trying to design it for novices, people who haven't used Microsoft Word, or maybe even not sure how to write a letter on a Microsoft Word or whatever. So the intention's fine. But fact of the matter is, by then, most of the users were professionals who are quite used to writing a letter and using Microsoft Word. So it was pretty much getting in the way rather than helping. So that was an example of unsolicited help that was not welcome. But and before you think I'm really bashing Microsoft, Microsoft has done better in recent times. So if you haven't already noticed this, this is an example, but also a tip for anytime you're creating a PowerPoint presentation is, if you haven't tried this yet, do try Design Ideas. Highly recommend. So this is now the new age AI, where you as a user can focus on the content writing. Yeah. And then the AI kicks in and it kind of suggests all of these design ideas, which are honestly speaking really good, and they're very sophisticated, and they look like a lot of effort has gone into it. And it can suggest a lot of different not just images, background images, fonts. It can suggest the whole layout in different ways, and you can turn it on and off. So simple as that. If you turn it on, it'll just keep giving you ideas. And so if you look at the image here, this is what's happening. The user in the center is typing something like the impact of air traffic control regulations by Dave Johnson. That's all they've written. And if you look to the bar, which under the design ideas bar, it's giving ideas for all the ways the title slide can be designed. And all you have to do is click on it. It'll apply it to your slide and create the title slide. Similarly for the rest of the slides. So I tend to use this quite a bit. Not so much for the lecture notes, because I think we tend to keep the focus on the content and bring in images that are necessary, not over the top. But sometimes we have like conference presentations or presentations to business partners and so on, and you want to make it a little bit more flash in the way that it looks a little bit more markety feel to it, which isn't the best for academia. So yeah, I guess you see what I mean. In any case, you can also hack this as a design. So in other words, if I wanted it to come up with an image of a particular thing, like because my topic was, say, air traffic control regulations, and none of the design ideas it's giving me so far includes an airplane, but I really want one, I can just put the title as airplane, and I'll start giving me ideas. I choose that, and then I can change go back and change the content to whatever it was. So you can kind of hack the designs by using mock content as well. So I find that it does improve productivity, and it improves the professionalism of the content. It's not unsolicited, but definitely welcome help from Microsoft in PowerPoint. Excel also has some new features that have the autofill features. Again, there's this, all sorts of funny stories about how autocorrect, and not autocorrect, but autofill has not done a good job in the past, but more recently, they've really worked in with the AI assistants to make it a lot better. So overall, like, why is it so difficult and so tricky to nail this idea of usability? We can see it when it's working well, and we can see it when it's terrible. But as designers, why is it so hard? So if we break this down and you kind of think about it, you say, well, who is involved in software development, right? So most of the time it's software developers, designers, testers, customers, stakeholders, right? Now, who has to use the software? Is the end users. It isn't these people above. It's not the software developer. Okay, software developers might also be the end users, but end users are, end users. Now, if you think about who captured the requirements and who wrote them down, so who wrote the user stories, for instance, it's not the end user most of the time, right? It's either the product owner, the proxy customer, the customer, or the software development team. So all of these people are attempting to role play and understand what the users want and write it up, which, to be fair, is, at least you're making an effort, but it's not the same thing as actually having an end user or two to actually guide you on the design of it. So here's a quote from Usability Basics for Software Developers article, which is an IEEE article. And it says, we can't predict a software system's usability without testing it with real users. So ultimately, when you go out in the industry, if you have the opportunity, or if you can possibly make the opportunity to have real users test your system, there's nothing like it, right? And again, in your educational experience, we try and simulate some of that, but it's not up until, say, year 4, when you probably have industry experience, or for those of you who have it earlier, you might actually get into a project team that might actually have access to an end user. And then you will see things much more differently if you do. But having said that, it's not easy to get your hands on end users. Unless it's things like, if you're working for Firefox, Chrome, or whatever as a browser, and you've just pushed out a new release and a new version, and you have some mechanism of capturing feedback, because then it's actually your actual users giving you feedback, and then you can use that feedback as requirements for the next version and the next release. And a lot of companies do this. All right, so what can we do? We have to consider, obviously, the users. Who are they? Not just the fact that there's some abstract concept of a user, but really, who are these people? What are their needs? What are their wants? What is there even an average user, or are we really talking about a widespread? So what does the software then need to cater to? For instance, going back to that Clippy idea, are my users mainly novice, letter writers, or even novice people who are new to computers, or are they professionals? So your design will alter drastically depending on your knowledge of who your key users are. And then there's the idea of the user interface, UI, as we call it. So how will your users interact with your software? What does that interaction look like? And this has been studied so much. There's a very popular book on it called Interaction Design. It's probably sitting somewhere here. And it's really goes into what is that human-computer interaction that you need to design for, and what are all the things that can go wrong, and how can you avoid them? Another aspect that's related, it's not the same as user interface, of course, is user experience. So once you know your user, once you've kind of designed the interface to be functional and appealing to your user, what is the overall experience that you are designing for? What do you want the user to experience? So how will the software impact them? Will it improve their productivity? Is it going to improve their creativity? Is it going to help them do, X, Y, and Z? Are they going to come off feeling frustrated from having used the system, or they're going to come off feeling, oh, they've got really assisted by the system? So what is that experience like? And then when we start to look at applying these ideas, then there are these paradigms, and some of you may be aware of this, is the idea of user-centered design, in that whatever you do, whatever design decision that you do, is done with the user at the center of it. What does it mean to the user? Is it going to help? Is it going to hinder? It's not just about, I want to try out the latest and the greatest technology, so I'm going to go with this design framework because that's what I want to do as a developer. No. So user-centered design is always coming back to your design decisions, and rationales need to be driven by what is good for the user. And then, as I said, interaction design. So these two concepts in particular, we want to apply as much as possible. Now, this is in a course on usability. So there are units on usability that if you wanted to take for your electives, for sure you can look into. Do recommend, because a number of software systems that you will be designing in university and in the industry will inevitably have some kind of a user interface, right? So understanding usability and design is actually really, really important. Okay, so now you might be hearing all of this and you're going, well, Rashida, I get it. It's really important. It's really core to the experience of the software. But is it really non-functional? Why are we calling it non-functional? So there are two kind of answers to it. You can argue, yes, it is non-functional because usability is a property that emerges from the system as a whole. It's not about functionality in the moment of the interaction, right? As I said before. How you interact with the different components can strongly affect the usability experience that you have from it, right? But you can also argue, no, they are not non-functional, because many of these aspects of things like usability can be defined in terms of functional requirements. So like the example I shared before, if you wanted to say, I want some, in terms of performance, my homepage should load within 1.5 seconds, that's very specific. So so the lines between the functional, non-functional might seem to blur. But the key point here is ultimately it really doesn't matter whether you classify it as functional or non-functional. These labels isn't what is so important. What is more important is that A, you're aware of it, and B, you're actually doing something about it, right? No matter what you actually end up calling it. So, and you want to manage them well, of course, and you want to satisfy these qualities in the software that you build. So for the purposes of the unit, we'll continue to refer to them as NFRs. But as I said, some of them have very specific functional aspects. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on the ones that are going to be hard to deal with, as typically NFRs tend to be. Not to say the functional ones are super easy to technically implement, but the non-functional ones are typically more difficult to understand and explain in the first place as to what exactly you want. Like, you can say, oh, I want a website that's really cool. Like, what does that mean? Or I want a website that is super accessible. Sure. But what does that mean? So you got to break it down in terms of how do you define accessibility? Okay, so these are some more lists of many other NFRs besides usability. So accessibility, compatibility, dependability, interoperability, portability, safety, scalability, security, maintainability, and many, many more. Okay, so all of these abilities, most of the time they end with ilities, are the quality attributes most of the time that we refer to as non-functional requirements. Now, some of them are actually what we call human aspects, and some other things that may not be non-functional requirements but are human aspects nonetheless. So that's the next part. Now, if you've got any questions on NFRs in the meanwhile, feel free to put it into the chat. But I'm going to move along and talk about human aspects now. Okay, so this here is a piece of work that was done here at Monash, and we looked at the idea of human aspects in requirements engineering. So what do we mean by human aspects? Now, we've talked about usability as a non-functional requirement, right? And we've talked about understanding and knowing the user because they are people. So human aspects, as the term name suggests, are all of these kind of traits that make you human, but also kind of help differentiate one human from the other, right? So things like your age, gender, ethnicity, culture, personality, motivation, your emotions, your domain knowledge, your values that you hold, and so on. So all of these are what we call human aspects. And what we did was we did a bit of research on understanding how well human aspects, especially of users, have been considered in requirements engineering. So when you're designing a system, do you just talk about this abstract idea of a user, or do you actually break it down and say, well, actually, for our product purposes, the age range of the user is so such and such, for instance, or we need to have specific features that cater to older age groups or younger age groups, and content that needs to be appropriate to children and all of that. So the age factor, how do you accommodate that and consider that in your design? Similarly for gender, similarly for personality and things like emotions. So what we found here is what you can see in the graph is a lot more studies have actually focused on the idea of personality. So personality has been studied quite a lot when we talk about requirements engineering. Emotions have been studied, motivation has been studied, and these are all among the individual human aspects, what individual humans have. Then in the middle section, you've got what we call the technical human aspects. So like, for example, your age and gender and stuff and ethnicity, you don't have a lot of control over these things in terms of it is what it is, or what you want it to be. But in terms of technical human aspects, it's something you can learn and you can acquire, and you can also sometimes lose things like domain knowledge, right? So when you gain some domain knowledge, it becomes a technical aspect that you have as a person. The errors that we make, the task workload, accessibility, and so on. And then there are team human aspects. So as not individuals, right? So as individuals, you may have personalities, but when you come together as a team, what kind of human aspects come into the fore? So you might have communication issues. You might have issues around the team maturity and the values of the team as a whole, and so on. So you will see that communication issues, for example, has been studied quite a lot. Age hasn't been studied a lot at all. And similarly, accessibility, human errors, and so on, actually still very nascent when it comes to studying them in requirements engineering. So that was talking mainly about users, but it's a kind of funny statement, but developers are humans too. We kind of tend to forget that sometimes, and we almost treat them as some kind of a robotic mechanism that is responsible for the creation of software. But no, we're also humans, the developers. And some of the human aspects of developers, and this is have been studied, and I'm sharing some of them. If you're interested, you can look this up. So Dr. Kashumi Madampe studied the idea of emotions in human developers. So this paper at the top that says the emotional roller coaster of responding to requirement changes in software engineering talks all about how software developers respond emotionally to when the requirements get changed. So far in your project, I don't think you've faced any changes in requirements per se. There might have been clarifications and so on, but a change is essentially when you've implemented it, or when you're planning to implement it, and then the customer comes up and says, well, actually, we're not doing that, right? So Agile in particular talks a lot about responding to change, and you're supposed to embrace that. But what we discovered in study was that's easier said than done. And developers actually have a whole, plethora of emotions that they go through during this software development, in terms of when they start the project, how they're feeling. If the requirement change comes along, what that makes them feel. If a requirement change comes along right at the end of a sprint, like when customers aren't meant to do that, but sometimes they do in industry. And what kind of emotions does that bring? Or you might have done 2 sprints worth of really good work, and the customer comes along and says, well, actually, it's all good. You're definitely getting paid for that. You've already been paid for that. That's fine. But I'm not going to use any of that. Can we just redo all of that as something different? So financially, you may not have a burden to pay, but emotionally it does drain you, because there's a lot of hard work, a lot of design, a lot of love went into that. So that's what this one studied, was the emotions. Then we have got Dr. Dulaji Hidalarachi, and she studied motivation and personality of software developers and what that means in terms of how they develop software. And then we've got a PhD fellow at the moment, Hashini Gunatilike, and she's looking at the idea of empathy. And this is particularly interesting because she's looking at empathy between software developers and end users, right? And we were really lucky to have access to a project where the developers in turn had access to end users, and they would hold these usability sessions on Zoom, and where they take the users through their latest software feature, and the users, not the customers, the actual sample representative end users, give them direct feedback on whether or not they like it or how usable it is, right? So for this kind of equation to work really well and not go south, you really need a lot of empathy in the process. Empathy from the developers for the users. So when they get those critical feedback, they actually understand where it's coming from, right? Of course, you want to be, respectful and constructive, but even with that, sometimes it's difficult to take negative feedback. And similarly for users, to try and understand maybe a little bit where the developers might have been coming from. So yeah, she's looking at empathy, and it's super interesting topic. So that little pie chart at the bottom that you see is one of the things that she's done in terms of early work on understanding. So one of the challenges is, how do you even measure empathy, right? And what kind of models and techniques can you use? So that's the preliminary work that Hashini did there. So yeah, so these are what we refer to as human aspects. They're kind of related to NFRs, but they're not the same thing. And now, you might be wondering, okay, all of that is really good, useful information, hopefully. And that's what you're wondering. But also you might be wondering, how is it going to influence, or what are you going to do about it in FIT 2101? So here's what we're wanting you to do, is to discuss with your product owners and clients in the next iteration, not now. This iteration, you just complete what you're doing. What NFRs, what non-functional requirements are important to them and why. So I'm not going to just say what is important to them, but it's also important to understand why, because the why will tell you a little bit about how you need to implement it so it will satisfy them. Okay, so for some product owners, they might say, well, usability is top. I don't, that is the one thing, even if it's not very private, I want to use high usability, something like that. For somebody else, they might say, I'm ready to live with a little bit lesser usability, but the security needs to be top notch, something like that. So you need to have a discussion with your product owners, and I'm talking about your actual product owners, which are the TAs, to understand this for your next cycle, right? Then you want to capture these NFRs as user stories, and then you implement them just like you would implement functional requirements. And remember, the kind of fine print between those two bullet points is, when you're talking to your product owners, you want to ask as many questions to get them to a point where they are providing you enough concrete details, and not just saying, oh, it should look good, it should be user-friendly, it should be fast. All of these adjectives are very vague. You can't really implement fast. So you need to have those follow-up questions about how fast is fast. Is 2 minutes fast, or is 2 seconds fast? So things like that. So those follow-up questions are going to be important. And then also, as a team, you want to consider which of the human aspects of end users are important to cater to in your project. Okay, and then you want to discuss that with your product owner and finalize it. So what we'll be looking for is an implementation of a non-functional requirement coming up in assignment 3, and an implementation of a human aspect coming up in assignment 4. So you want to document that, implement that, and of course demo it to your customers when it's ready. Cool, so that's all I had for today. When we release the assignment 3 brief, which will be very shortly, it will give you a little bit more on the NFRs and how to do that. But yeah, essentially, if you think of them as just another kind of requirement that needs to be captured, documented, implemented, and demonstrated, that's the approach you want to take with it. Cool. So that's what I had for today. As a heads up, on Thursday, we're going to be conducting, because you would have submitted your assignment in the morning, 9:30. So when we meet at 6 in the evening, the idea would be for us to do a mini a sprint review with your actual product owners. So that you would have come already by Thursday, done one with your proxy product owner, which is one of your team members. But on the day of the workshop, you get to do a quick review. So you get to demo your product briefly to your product owner. And remember, they also have your video. So they will kind of corroborate those two pieces of information, which is the video that you submit and what you demonstrate on the actual day of the workshop to them, and they might have some quick follow-up questions as well. So that's one. The second part is we're going to be doing a mini sprint retrospective. So you would have already done your retrospective by then, but this is going to be a mini one where you might be, you might want to build on top of what you've already got in your retrospective based on the latest feedback or comments that you got from your customer. Right. And again, this allows you to get quick feedback, so you can actually start incorporating ideas into sprint 2 already. You don't have to wait for us to mark everything and get the feedback then. So this is early preliminary feedback, so highly recommend making use of it. And the final thing we're going to be doing is you're going to be doing the actual sprint planning for sprint 2, okay, in the workshop. So that would be a great opportunity to bring up this idea of the non-functional requirements with your product owner and the idea of the human aspects. And of course, they'll be prepared and ready for your questions. So I hope that is all clear. I'll send out an ad post with all of these details as usual also. So yeah, that's all I had for today. If anyone has any questions, pop them into the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. I can stop recording if that is easier. But otherwise, I will see you on Thursday, and I'm going to stick around if you have any questions.